here we are on another episode. It just keeps going, Renee. What are we going to talk about today?
Well, I'm excited because we're going to start on a brand new series talking about strategic planning and how that ties back to all the work that we do all the time. But before we dive into all of that, so Jason, what in the world is going on with the farm in the middle of June? What's going on?
I don't even know because I'm traveling and speaking all of June.
Oh,
So it's hard to keep up on things. I do know, what we're doing, and I delegate to my brother-in-law the spraying because we like to do a lot of this nutrient management stuff, and it means a
hmm.
lot of passes with the sprayer. And so I kind of just sit that out, I'll be honest.
That's not your favorite thing, huh?
Not my
All
favorite
right.
thing at all.
All right. Well, today we're going to talk about strategic planning. And this, to some people, may seem like this is a very different and off topic of what we normally talk about with mental health, but it actually isn't, because if you have a good strategic plan and you actually know where you're going, it actually saves the mental health of you and all your employees who typically don't even know what's going on in the world. And so you can improve morale and you can improve your employees' mental health by just helping them have a plan. So we're going to talk about strategic planning and show some data on that, and then talk about some of the stories of places where we've worked and different systems that we've helped, because this is something you can do, your personal self, having a strategy plan, and you can do this for your small business, you can do it for a big business, you can do it for a huge state system. And so it's something that's important across the line. So Jason, to kick us off, why is this important? Why do we need a strategic plan, and why do we care?
Well, I go back to one statistic, and it's 95% of employees don't understand their company's strategy. And
Wow.
I think that pretty much sums it up, right?
Yeah.
And I do strategic planning as well with farmers, right? It's the
Yeah.
same no matter what business you're in,
That's right.
whether you're with your family, whether you work with someone else, whether you work for a state institution, everyone has to be on board. Everyone has to see what the future goals are, what the goals and objectives are, and where we're going. And if everyone doesn't see that same mission, vision, right, then
Yeah.
then you have chaos. And that's when we go into systems, right, Renee? It doesn't matter what the size of the system, the type
Mm-mm.
of business, for profit, not for profit.
Mm-mm.
We go into chaos because everyone doesn't understand where they're going and everyone's going in a different direction.
Yeah. And I took on a new task in 7, 8 months ago now, and had different leadership before me and get there, and it's chaos. It just felt like chaos. And there just wasn't operating procedures really written down or nailed down. There's a lot of legacy on the way things have always been, but nobody remembers why we do it that way. And then it pretty much was said, well, now you're in charge, so you can do whatever you want. And that sounded overwhelming. And it just, yeah. And so strategic planning is like my immediate go-to. It's like, wait a second, what are we supposed to be doing here? Let's go back and look at, like you said, that the mission and values is where we start. What is and in my role, the code of Iowa and the rules of Iowa actually spell it out. So I could go right back to the law and say, this is what we're supposed to be doing. And then we can go back and then hold up everything to it and say, is this what we're supposed to be doing? Or is this additional that maybe we don't need to be doing? It just really gives you some clarity. And then when you let your team be part of the planning, then everybody feels excited about it and kind of buys in, because they're not that 95%. Could you imagine working somewhere where you have just no idea why you're there or what you're doing? I mean, how depressing and how just terrible for your own just self-care and self-worth. I mean, it just has to be really hard to not know what you're doing.
Well, and it comes down to communication, right? And so there's
Yeah.
lots of different flavors. And so, if you were to go out and Google strategic planning, you're going to get like 8 million results, right? Of all the different ways you can strategically plan. And I think that's why we want to talk about it here today, is kind of like, what are the high level principles of
Yeah.
strategic planning and how do we communicate that with our staff, right? Because in general, leadership isn't doing that. And so we see that in the different systems. We see that in the hospitals we go into. We see it in state government, right? That ability to cascade messages throughout. It's a skill, and it's a skill that I don't think is taught very well. And so
Mm-hmm.
we need to think about, how do we help people communicate? And as consultants, a lot of times we go into places. I spend more time teaching people about communication, right? And over
Mm-hmm.
communication. And how do you
Mm-hmm.
communicate these things are happening? How do you communicate with your staff? How do you communicate with stakeholders? How do you communicate it with your community? Because that's what's forgotten. And it seems like common sense, Renee, but sometimes we have to remember common sense isn't so common.
Oh, agreed. And sometimes we get there and you realize what we're, because the goal at the end of the day is you can really get some clarity and set some goals based on this plan that you're trying to make. And then it should be measurable. It should be things that you can actually see if it's working and hold people accountable, which is a big part of it as well. And, we've been talking through the podcast series now, my kind of back and forth with remote work, hybrid work, whatever you want to call it, and accountability is going to be the ticket for me to figure out what to do. Because if we can get everybody with their job responsibilities down and have them to be accountable to that, then the location of where somebody is working is a little less important, right? As long as we can figure out, okay, these are the things that are supposed to get done in the time fashion they're supposed to, so that everybody else can get their work done, then the where you are doesn't matter as much. And so it's that accountability piece. And I think we miss that sometimes too. But I'm really excited about this conversation because strategic planning, if done well, can just give us so many benefits, and you can be more clear, more focused, and then have a sense of purpose even when you're going to work, because you know what your piece is and why it matters and how it fits into that bigger picture. And that's an exciting reason to go to work, and not we're just doing it for the money.
And maybe we shouldn't call it strategic planning. Maybe we should just call it planning, because sometimes even the word strategic kind of freaks people out. People are like, I don't know if I can be strategic or not. Well, you know what? We just need a plan, right? And so sometimes when I sit down with people, I'm like, what's your plan? And if I get a blank stare back across the table to me, I know that we're going to have some work to do. Because sometimes it's hard just to have a plan, right? And because that plan helps you to identify focus areas, right? And focus areas are exactly what it means. We need to focus in these areas, right? And sometimes that focus will lead us to needing to have major initiatives, right? Like, this is the things we have to do if we're going to be successful.
Yeah.
And so then we have to create plans to hold ourselves accountable to meet those benchmarks for what we need to do. And we have to execute on those plans, right? And that's sometimes it's creating the plan that's the difficulty, but so oftentimes we see it's that execution piece that is really the most challenging, because you have to see it through. And that can be really hard, especially if you're a visionary, right? So oftentimes we look at folks who are in leadership positions, executive directors, CEOs, they're visionaries, right? And they're visionaries, and they're in that role for a purpose because they're really good at being visionaries. But one of the things that visionaries aren't so good at is execution and accountability and seeing things through, because it's not always fun when you have to do the down and dirty work of seeing things through. It's fun, and I'm kind of a visionary sometimes, right? I like to kind of be up in the clouds now and then, and I know you won't argue with that, Renee. Of having some ideas, and being the idea guy, and I love that, but I need to have people around me who help with the timelines and the nuts and bolts of everything, right? And that's where project management and execution are so essential. And I see that missing in so many of the social service. Sometimes it's for profit, sometimes it's not for profit, but that entire kind of sector doesn't do a great job at that.
No. And to your point, not everybody can be the visionary, but you need the people that do the work. And so it is all about the team. And for the team to know what's in your head as the visionary, you got to write it down. People can't read people's minds. And so to make this work, right, there has to be a whole lot of people who do the work, and that's what they love to do, right? Different people have different personalities. Some of those executors, they were those behind the scenes, never want to be out in public, just want to do the work and know they've done a good job. And that is what drives them and lights their fire. They love that. But that only works when they know what they're doing and how it kind of connects to the big picture. And they're not really unhappy if they're just working their butts off and they can't see how it fits in, or they don't ever get, any kind of kudos for how it works. So it's like, from a leadership perspective, helping them see their spot and see their point. But the only way I'm going to know that is if I have a plan and have mapped that out so that I could look at that team and say, okay, these are their gifts. How do we help them do the best that they can be and go the direction they need to go? But you can't do that without a plan. Otherwise, it's just everybody going different directions, and there's no puzzle. There's just a hot mess. And you're right. We see a ton of that, because you might get those go-getters in a system or a hospital, but they're doing their go-getting, but not in the direction the leadership would really want them to go, because they've got it all fired up and they're all passionate about something and they go off. But then leadership is like, what is happening over here, and it gets pretty confusing. So the idea of this plan is so that you, not for just yourself, and that's why you can do this for yourself, but you can do this for your team, you can do it for the whole organization, and you need to have the plan that works at multi-levels so that it all goes the same direction.
And let's just reaffirm, it's a written plan that you share with everyone across your organization and other stakeholders and your board, right?
That's right.
And so there can be varying levels of detail to that plan. It may be a high level plan that goes to staff and the board, and then there's a real detailed plan that has like accountability built in and how you're going to measure it. That may be more of a document just within the leadership team, right? Of how it actually gets done, because sometimes these plans can look overwhelming. And so you have to kind of sort out who are you going to share what with, right? Not that you're not being transparent, but simply that everyone needs to know the big direction of where we're going, how we're going to get there, how we're going to measure it. But then each department or each area needs to dig into their own detail, right? Because we also have to teach everyone to stay in their own lane, right? Because we have everyone trying to do everyone's job, we're not efficient anymore, right? And that's what the plan can help us to do. It can help get organized so everyone knows who's responsible for what. So then we're all pulling in the same direction, right? And so I think, why do we want to do these plans, Renee? So I think about this, all sounds good. And so why don't people do it, right? Because we know the data, right? Let's jump into some data. Companies with written business plans grow 30% faster, right? And that's across all sectors, right? And so we can link some of these things. That's from the Journal of Management Studies. We can throw some links in the show notes this time. 71% of fast-growing companies have strategic plans, business plans, or similar long-range planning tools. They have that in place. It's written and it's known by their employees, right? Nonprofits who have a written plan are more likely to collaborate with others, more likely to boards being open to taking calculated risk, and are more likely to have formal processes for measuring leadership effectiveness. Despite that, 49% of nonprofits don't have a written strategic plan. I can't believe I'm even reading that, Renee. 49% of nonprofits don't have a written strategic plan. What do you hear when I say that?
Half of them are going to fail. That's what I'm hearing. I mean, the
there's
failure rate's high when you don't have a plan.
They're certainly not going to meet the objectives of their mission, right? They're not going to be able, we know statistically, to retain staff because everyone doesn't know their purpose, doesn't know where they're going. And so I struggle sometimes when I hear about nonprofits or others struggling to make it. And I think, what are you doing for yourself, right? When I hear about employee retention challenges, I think about this and I think, well, what are you doing to help yourself? How are you engaging your staff? And it's, for me, all these things tie together. And so I get all worked up, Renee, I'll just tell you right now, because these are the things you have to do as a business, whether you're for-profit or not-for-profit, to be successful, to serve your mission, to meet your goals and objectives that you want to do.
And I think about this from the legislative side. One of the things that used to get me fired up was when people came to ask for money. Money doesn't fix everything. If you don't have a plan on how you're going to use the money and how the money actually then moves you forward, and then you can sustain the money ongoing. There was always this term about one-time dollars being used for ongoing expenses. And in government specifically, we're really bad about that. There's lots of these grant opportunities, these one-time dollars that get infused all the dang time. And if you don't have a plan and you don't know how those monies are going to be utilized well, when the cliff happens, when the money drops off, which invariably it will, how are you going to sustain it? And there's so many times, I can count how many times, probably can't even count. It's so many times that you just end up in a space where they don't have any plan for what happens when the money goes away, as if the money's going to last forever. Or they would come to you and ask you to give it the money, but they couldn't tell you exactly how it would work. In the mental health specific region in our state, that is an ongoing beat of the drum of we need more money, we need more money, we need more money. And at some points in time, even the State Department would say, no, we don't, because we don't know where we're going. And more money would just make that worse. And so there have to be times when you actually have to slow down the influx of cash because they didn't have a plan that could be moved fast enough to actually spend the dollars in a wise way. And people get upset about that, but that's actually true. So if you can't get the strategic plan, and this is the same for nonprofits, right? You're going to your boards to raise money or to go get grants or whatever. And if you don't have a plan, those getting of the grant dollars doesn't work. And we've helped organizations get those dollars. And then we've seen what happens on the backside when they don't really have a plan to absorb the dollars.
You know, Ray, we were just in a state next door. I won't say which state, and they just lost half of their funding across all of their mental health regions because they didn't spend it. Yet we go talk to the regions and they say we don't have enough money. Well, you didn't use the money you had for the past 3 years because you didn't have a plan on what you were going to do. And so now the state said, well, you didn't use all the money we gave you, so there must not be a need, which makes some reasonable sense.
It does 100%.
And so it's really hard to have conversations because it's like, well, what was your plan? How are you all pulling together? How are you fulfilling your obligations? And so with that chaos, you can see just compounds, right? And so that's why we're having this conversation today, because it doesn't matter of what level of organization you're in, or whether it's state government or whether it's a quasi-state entity. Everybody needs to have a clear plan. And if you have staff, your staff need to understand your mission and vision and how you're going to get to where you're going. And when I look at the statistics, I see that over half of nonprofits don't even have a written plan. Then how do their staff know? You know, how easy is it for an organization to drift, right? To lose track of what their mission and vision is if you don't have it in writing and you're not regularly communicating that.
And I honestly just don't understand how people can make a budget without a plan. I mean, you and I are in a small business together. We have a plan. We have some really great ideas sometimes that we well know we can't afford because it doesn't go with the plan. Now, that doesn't mean it can't be an out-year plan or an out-year idea, but it gives you kind of bumpers and guardrails, if you will. So when you want to start a podcast, I wanted to start a podcast 3 years ago, but I wasn't in a place where that made sense, not just financially, but also time-wise and resource-wise. And I had my business manager with me who would say, we can't do that right now. But she wouldn't say never. It was just this right now. And so by the time it did come, now it's the perfect time for lots of different reasons. But the only way I would know that is to have that plan. And then to also have the finances match the plan. And so that's part of what we see also in nonprofits, at least some of the ones we've worked with, is the finances aren't matching a plan. Even if they have a vision plan, then the finances don't match, or they can't explain the finances. And all of that is just not good when you're trying to get grant dollars or, legislative funding. The legislature's smarter than that. And they are like, yeah, to your point, didn't spend the money. One of the stories similar to the state next door, our regions used to have ending balances of millions and millions and millions of dollars. And they want the state to give them more money for mental health. Legislators are like, why? You have millions and millions in the bank. And so they didn't get it. And those regions would be mad that they hadn't got it, but they didn't spend the money they had in the bank. Again, it just goes in a circle. It's that lack of plan. So Jason, we've been talking about some places that we've worked, but talk to us about like that, a system change. So say that we've got a big system change coming up. How could strategic planning help the entities that are dealing with system? We always have system changes, right? They come in big waves. It always happens. So we've got new ones on the horizon. So how does a strategic plan, where would somebody start if they're like, holy crap, the law changed, something passed, a system change is coming? How would a plan help them kind of go through those waters?
Yeah, absolutely. I can think of several examples of large projects working on right now, Renee, that are directly resulted from legislation change, right? And that legislation change will either completely eliminate a certain portion of an organization, or it will create opportunity to grow in a different direction. And so in order to really figure that all out, it's really important, and that's what we do, is we go in and help clear people's minds, right? Of where are the areas we need to focus? How do we figure out what are the actual goals we need to do? And so, there was one organization we went into and we said, okay, who do you want to be at the end of all of this, right? Where's your ideal state? And then we create a plan to get there, right? Because there's 3 or 4 different scenarios of where things can go. And so,
Mhm.
we help to find some clarity and develop a roadmap that says, here's how we get you from point A to point B, even through all this transition. And in the process, we're like, you can't get there unless you retain your staff,
Mhm.
right? And so as that became clear, we're like, then how do we help your staff to understand that they can get through this with you? Because if we don't have a plan that's communicated to staff, what's going to happen if everyone reads in the newspaper, your organization is no longer funded
Mhm.
as of 1 year from now? Is
Mhm.
everyone going to stay until that last day to
Mhm.
fulfill your mission? Or where do you think people go, Renee?
Yeah, we actually have that happen. So we were sharing space due to a health issue in our office, and we got transferred into a different office. It was one of the boards that was going away July 1st. And because the board's getting absorbed July 1st, some of the employees could have moved and been absorbed, but because they didn't understand or didn't really get a good feeling about what that could look like or a big picture of like how they would be used in that new space, they just started jumping ship. And so by the end, it's only a couple people left and no idea how the actual work is going to get accomplished for those last couple of months because there's no employees. And so that's why we were talking about the importance of communication. So, Jason, how do you do that cascading communication you mentioned early on? How do we help people know the plan once you make a plan?
Yeah, and so a lot of times when we meet with folks, we meet with leadership, we create a plan, we develop alongside them a plan, and then we put it, in a timeline factor, or we find a way to present it, right? Because one of the things that's really difficult is how do you articulate that information back? And so in a couple of cases, we've actually gone into staff meetings and shared what their leadership team did. And when we do that, we actually start with purpose, mission, vision, guiding principles, core values, whatever that organization has. And I shouldn't be shocked, Renee, but many times when I read those to the staff, because I start the meeting with that, because I'm like, well, we're going to see just exactly is all the staff on board. And sometimes staff are like, that's the first time I've seen that in a long time.
Yeah.
And I think it really helps to ground people when we start there and say, everything we're going to talk about today goes back to this, right? Your
Yeah.
goals, where leadership is going to take you over the course of the next 12 months, 18 months, especially if there's a lot of transition and change on the horizon. We want you to know that this organization is going to stay core to who they are. And your leadership team is on board with that. And this is where we think you're going, right? And this is how they're going to guide
Mm-hmm.
this ship and how they're going to navigate this storm, and we want you to be part of it. And so our presentation really is about, they want you to be part of it, but they want to be transparent. And we got some pushback in a meeting not too long ago where they're like, but people haven't been transparent in the past. And I said, well, maybe not, but that was the past. And so
That's right.
here's the plan moving forward. And there's accountability built into the plan,
Mm-hmm.
because we all struggle sometimes as leaders. I know in the past, when I was in leadership positions, I probably didn't communicate as good as I could have either. I needed some accountability and coaching around that area as well. And so
Yeah.
I see it as being so valuable. And a lot of those staff left saying, you know what? I know I may not have a job in 12 or 18 months, but I feel really good about what you're doing. And that's probably going to keep me here longer as long as you keep me updated, as
Yeah.
long as I know what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a future. Everybody has to make their own decisions about what's best for them. And I think if there's a good understanding between leadership and people about, what, we're going to take care of you too, right? And we're going to share with you all the information we have so you can make the best decision, because then people aren't going to leave because they're making stuff up because of the lack of information. And when
Yeah.
I see people leave organizations, it's because they make stuff up because of the lack of information. And I asked this team, I said, well, what if there's nothing to communicate? Should people communicate with you? And they said, would you please, and this went to the leadership, would you please communicate with us even if there's nothing to communicate? Can you send an email that says, we have nothing new to share with you this week?
Yeah.
That's all the staff wanted. And so I was kind of like, oh, really? But then I'm like, well, the staff just told you exactly what they need to feel reassured. So guess
Yeah.
what? You all better listen to that and you better
Mm-hmm.
provide it to them. And I thought that was such a valuable day, Renee,
Yeah.
because that 1 hour, 60-minute meeting where we went over that, the staff shared their needs, and all they wanted was, even if you don't know what's going on, share it with us, because then we won't make stuff up in our own heads.
Yeah.
Wow. How
Yeah.
valuable would that be to
Mm-hmm.
an organization who wants to keep their staff, who wants to create a good work environment? That's a
Yeah.
really simple step to take once a week. I think that 30-second email to type it up and send it out, if really there's nothing going on, would be well worth it.
Yep, I have a tradition now. It's a what's happening Wednesday email that goes out every week. I have a task that clicks on Tuesday to remind me to make sure it goes out. Sometimes I have a lot of stuff to share. Sometimes I don't have a lot of stuff to share, but it's my weekly commitment to the team to tell them what I know or what's updates on what's happening. We've had so much turmoil with just moving and different weird things that have been happening. And so sometimes it's all about the building and all the challenges, and other times it's about some of the strategic planning projects that are happening that are good things, and some research grants that we're working on and different things. And so yeah, it's amazing. I don't know how many people always read the email, so that's a fun fact too. And if you think about people's personalities, there's some people that are still not in the know, even though I've communicated that way, which drives me crazy. But at least I feel good about it from my side, saying, hey, I've done it. One
As
more
long
thought.
as one person in the break room has read the email, they'll say, "Oh, but wait, there was an email," to all the people who didn't read the email. See,
That's
I'm big on that, because if you're
true.
communicating with everyone, you're then managing people's right of all that stuff that happens outside. And so, and if you're an executive saying, well, I do communicate with my people, well, do your supervisors communicate with their staff, right? This is
Right.
where we talk about cascading messages. It's
That's
just
right.
not about the
No.
CEO communicating, it's about everyone under them
Yeah.
communicating as well. And that's where this breaks down, right?
Yeah.
9 times out of 10, the CEO may communicate it with their direct reports, but do their direct reports communicate it to their direct reports all the way throughout the lines of the organization? And depending on how big your organization is, that can be a challenge, right? And one email may not be enough. It may need to be in a newsletter. It may need to be in a video communication. It may need to be in all these different areas, depending on how your organization communicates. It takes time, right? You talked about you have to have a reminder in the midst of all of the million fires you're putting out in a given week. Is this the thing that you're going to say, oh, I got nothing to share, I'll share it next week? And then next week, oh, I've got nothing to share, I'll share it next week. Well, then you breed that we don't know what's going on, they must not be doing anything, they don't care about us mentality in your workplace. I see it happen over and over again. And so you really have to analyze, and look at your leadership style and figure out, it was hard for me to do that, Renee, I'll tell you. It's hard for me to stay on task and do that, but it's so important to your workplace.
Yeah. And one of the partners that I have to share our mission and values with is our collaborative partners. It's not
Yep.
within the organization itself,
Yep.
but it even goes further than that. And I have started with a presentation we're doing with our collaborative partners, and I start with our mission and values, and they have no idea that we're different than them, that we see the world different than them. And when I start there, it lowers the animosity, it increases the education of it, and then people are like, oh, I didn't know you saw this differently than we do, or, oh, I didn't realize your mission is different than ours. And it helps just clarify. So you're right. It's all the way down staff, but then also it could be some partners, like you said, the board, people that aren't necessarily, they need to know and they need to understand, especially if you have people speaking on your behalf. They have to be on the same page, because that happens sometimes. And so you've got somebody speaking on your behalf and maybe they're not sharing the same focus areas that you are, and that's not going to work. So we've done it with our partners, and starting with the mission and values. One thing it's done is, because every time I say it, my team hears it again, so it's repetitive for the team, because now it's a presentation we just keep giving, so they hear the mission and values over and over and over, but the partners hear it, and it's just a different slant. And so then everything we're doing, if we have challenges or problems, which always happen, we tie it back to, here's why we see this differently than you, because this is our mission, this is our values, this is, and then they're like, oh, okay. So then it's not animosity anymore, and then it's just difference of vision, and we have different roles. And so it's just so helpful. But you can't do that if you don't have that plan and you don't have that mission out there. You have to start with something so that you can all unify around the work you're doing. And if you don't have it written down, I'm telling you, for a lot of time, I kept a lot of this stuff in my head, and nobody can read my mind. And so I can't fault anybody for not understanding the mission and values if I didn't take the opportunity to write it down. And then the plan has to include your people, so they have buy-in to the plan. And so when I've learned those two major things, nobody can read my mind, and I can't just do it all by myself. Those two big life lessons have made this so much easier, because now we create plans without. One of the things though, Jason, that I know you do a lot is you're that third party that kind of helps people do it, because I can do strategic plans all day, but I couldn't do it with my own team because I needed to be part of the team, not leading it. So talk about that third party. How is that helpful? How have you seen that work?
Well, I think the great thing is a third party comes in without those blinders on, right? Because we all have blinders sometimes in our role. And so when a third party comes in, they can ask those questions, they can clarify things, and they can create a level of accountability, right?
Mm,
And I think that's something that's really important to leverage. As a leader, I think sometimes you need to leverage that. Sometimes just having someone else say something may lend a piece of credibility that you could say it all day long, and your folks just
mhm.
aren't going to believe it when you say it. And so I think the sooner that you can just embrace that there's some things you can say all day long and people are going to be like, yeah, that's not real. But when someone else comes in and says, hey, I noticed this, and says the same thing, they'll be like, oh, he's right. That happens, right? That's just
It
human
does.
nature. I mean,
It
and so that's
does.
just how it works in workplaces sometimes, how it works in systems sometimes. And I
Yeah.
think that's the benefit of having a third party consultant come in, having someone come in, lead the process, because then the leaders can actually be part of the process. They can free up
Mhm.
that part of their brain so that they can think strategically about where are we going? Does that make sense for us? Right.
Mhm.
And kind of put some of that off and then allow that third party consultant, to kind of draw up the documents and say, here's what we heard. Take
Yep.
this, react to it, respond to it, make it yours, right? And I
Yeah.
think just going through that process ends with a much better product. It ends with, maybe framing some things in a way that they never would have thought about framing them had they
Mhm.
not kind of opened themselves up to thinking about things a little differently. And I think it doesn't have to be a long-term engagement. It can just be around, a specific time frame of saying, here's what we'll do. You have a situation, a major transition coming up. Let's have you come in, help us design a plan for that, and then meet with us regularly and hold us accountable. Right. And I'm not actually holding them accountable. I'm just sitting there saying, hey, here's the timeline. This was assigned to, Jack. This was assigned to John. This was assigned to Sally. Where are you all at? It says on the timeline that you were going to be completed with this task A by this date and you'd be on to task B. Are you all on track? And then
Yeah.
everyone has to say out loud, I'm on track or I'm not on track. It's a
Right.
beautiful experience.
Yeah. Well, and for our listeners out there, we've had Jason had to come in and help with my office because I knew I couldn't do it myself. And they tell us how much fun he was and how brilliant he was and all of this. And he's like just not shocked or surprised because he just knew he was. So he
That's
really,
exactly right. I really enjoy hearing those things, Renee. So we need to hear more of
I know
that.
I need to tell you more often, right? How smart you are. I know your wife will totally agree with that idea.
Oh, no, she
Totally.
doesn't agree. I don't know what's going on there.
So the recovering politician self-care policy of the week. Um, I had a really brilliant coach because we always talk about how I use coaches, and I really do. I use what I preach. I talk about coaching and mentoring, and it's important to me. And a wise person told me a little while back that I was way too available in the office, which sounded crazy, except that when you're there 24/7, sometimes you can't think, and then everybody brings all their crises to you because you just happen to be there. And I was like, this is brilliant. And so for me, it's a change of environment. And so sometimes I need to just think of like, it's not that I'm not working, but sometimes I need to work in a different location so that I can think differently and maybe get a little more privacy or a little bit away. And so it's been really good for me to just schedule it out on the calendar, to just not maybe be in the same location. And everybody in our office has remote work days, but I was catching myself not taking that opportunity. And so I wasn't really modeling that for everybody else. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense as a leader. And so I really challenged myself to model that into work from other locations. And so for me, it's been good. It's good for my mental health. It gives me a little more flexibility. And then trying to learn more about remote and hybrid work, it's good for me to have that part back. And it's a weird blend because I was 100% at home for so long. Now I'm mostly in an office. And for me, that's a weird transition. So I really challenge people out there, maybe it's not the job that you're not liking, or maybe it's not what, it's making you frustrated. Maybe you just need a change of pace sometimes. And maybe that needs to be at a coffee shop. And if you're a solopreneur working by yourself all the time, maybe you need to move into a place where you can co-work with others sometimes and work in some of those co-working spaces so that you can get a little bit of support and social. So just think about like how maybe it isn't the job if you still love your work, but you're just not settled with maybe it's a new environment. So Jason, you have any thoughts around any of that?
I do, Renee. I think about, I spend a lot of time on the road. We have projects on the road, and there's a project manager that works with us, and I just determined that sometimes we need to debrief at the end of the day, and so we have strategic planning sometimes after supper, where we'll debrief and really think about and strategize for the next day. And so I think you have to create that time in your work day to be able to do those things.
Yeah, I agree. Well, today we kick off a new series about strategic planning. I'm intending to have a guest if they will agree to come on to talk more about their position on strategic planning and project management, and then looking at like a deeper dive into strategic planning in the upcoming days. But what we started with today is about why is it important, and really thinking about your mission, your values, your principles, that everything really ties back to that. And then your communication that you have with your staff, your partners, your boards is really based on that. So if you don't have the clarity that you need in that space, it's going to make your job a lot harder. We've got a lot of information for you in the show notes. We'll see you again next time. Have a great day.